I'm Dennis with Classic Rides Arizona. Today we're working on my 68 Firebird. It's my daily driver, so there's a few things that I need to do just to make it a little bit more comfortable to drive, a little bit more reliable. We're putting a 4-link rear suspension in from Ridetech. That's going to improve the ride quality and allow me to adjust the suspension depending on what I'm using it for, and make it a little more comfortable when I got the kids in the car as well. It has a mini tub. It's mini tubbed in the back. It's got a forward 9-inch, and there were a few issues with the way I did that previously that this is going to fix. This is the Ridetech 4-link, and these coilover shocks here are the handling quality, which means they're a single adjustable shock. You can adjust the rebound damping rate. You can adjust the height using the coilovers as well. This bolts right into your factory setup in the rear. You remove your leaf springs and it'll bolt right into your original 67 to 69 Camaro or Firebird. And it improves your handling and your ride quality. It gives you a lot of ability to adjust things. You can adjust for traction, for your ride height, and for how it rides as well. It's a pretty slick setup. It has the Ridetech bushings in these control arms, and it's a really slick bushing where your rubber deflects a lot, your polyurethane squeaks a lot, and over time it will cold flow, which means it just kind of oozes where the circle in the bushing, it becomes an oval. I know this because it's what I've experienced. I put polyurethane bushings on this car when I rebuilt it 21 years ago, when I rebuilt the suspension, and now it's time to do it again. So this time I'm going with a Ridetech. It's got a 1,000,001 mile warranty on all of this stuff, which is great because I've had this car for 22 years. So I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. So it will do me good to put good quality stuff in this car. And since it's a daily driver, it's going to be a lot more comfortable and for me to drive it every day and to take the family out in it. Here we have the handling quality coilover. This is the lower axle mount. If you have the leaf spring mounts, originally they were on the car, and you want to keep them in the stock location, you would get a different mount. This one, since I'm putting a new mount on the axle, because I'm mini tubbed, I want to move them in just a little bit, I get this mount that welds in place. It's an option. The lower links and the upper links on this one are double adjustable, so that I can lengthen or shorten them depending on the pinion angle that I want and how I set it up. It gives me the ability to fine tune it a little bit. I'm going to turn this bar over up front. This is the factory leaf spring mount from the front, and how this is set up is it offsets the lower links inboard on the car to give you more room for tires in the back. In my case, my car is mini tub, so I want all the space I can get so I can clear big tires. This just bolts right in the stock leaf spring mount, so you don't have to modify anything for that. This cross member bar here that mounts the upper links and the coilovers, and the optional sway bar, if you add it, it bolts right into the floor. You'll drill some holes and mount it, and we'll show you how to do that. It's a pretty slick setup. Comes with some tools, all the hardware you need, block off plates for the factory shock mount locations if you need to do that, and the instructions, and a 1,000,001 mile warranty card, which is nice to remind you of that. So far we've dropped the fuel tank out of here. We've removed the shocks. This car has been mini tubbed, and the shocks have been relocated to the inside of the leaf springs. I'm running a forward 9-inch rear end here, so depending on what you have in your car, it could be a little bit different. We removed the shocks, and we're going to remove the tailpipes from the exhaust, and we're going to take out the leaf springs and support the rear end here to get ready to install the Ridetech 4-link. We've removed the tailpipes, cut off the axle mounts and cleaned off the welds, and removed the pinion snubber that was up here on the floor so that we can clear the brackets that go up there. Next, we're going to test fit this cross member here, and then we'll continue cleaning and then mount it in place. We cleaned off the mounting points where the cradle is going to touch the floor. We had to hammer on the front. We had to hammer the floor where the cross members go across, just so they would clear a little bit better. On the back, we ended up having to bend these tabs down just a little bit because they were keeping the cradle from going all the way up into the car. In order to get the cradle all the way into the car, still we had to use a floor jack just to press it a little bit higher. And then we drilled through the whole mounting holes using them as a pilot and installed the thread forming bolts here. We're going to drill some more holes and continue installing the thread forming bolts. These are the mounting plates and the bolts that hold the rear of the cradle in place. And what I'm going to do here before I put them in place from the inside of the trunk is I've got some of this flexible strip caulking from Eastwood. And it works really well to seal any pass-throughs from the inside to the outside of the car. And it keeps water from getting through this location because there is a possibility in the rain of rain that's splashing up from the road coming through the trunk right here. So I wrapped it around the bolt and I'm going to press it in place. Before we started, we removed the back seat so that we could have access to drill through the floor here. When we actually tried to drill through the floor from the bottom, since we left the rear end in place so that we wouldn't pull the drive shaft out of the transmission, the rear end was in the way, so we weren't able to drill these center 3 holes through the floor. So what we did was we drilled the 2 outer holes and then bolted the sandwich plate, this plate in place from the inside of the car. And then we got inside the car and drilled straight through. Now we're going to bolt it up, torque everything down, and then move on to the next bolts. Since we struggled to get the cradle to seat all the way, we messed up the threads on some of the thread forming bolt locations, and we weren't able to drill all the locations either. And so in order to just be extra careful, make sure that the upper cradle stays in place, I'm going to run some stitch welds around the outside here just to make sure that everything is secure. For the Ridetech lower link mounts, you take the original factory leaf spring mount from the front, and you have to drill out the 1/2-inch holes up to 5/8. That's what we already did here, so that you can mount the lower link in place. After stitch welding all the cradle and the top, we painted it, then mounted the lower links in place, and then it was time to locate the axle, or locate the rear end where it should be. So to do that, we measured the width of the front mounts from the center of the front link to the center of the link on the opposite side, and made sure that the rear mounts would be the same. First thing we had to do was to center the rear end under the car. So we've got a string line mounted here. We centered it side to side using the string lines that were right at the center of the wheel well opening. And then we measured from the same point on each side to the center line of the axle and made sure that, that we were straight there. Once we got the rear end centered front to back and side to side, then we measured the pinion angle, made sure that the pinion angle was right, and then went back through and measured everything again. checked it all again, because each time we moved one thing, it would move another thing slightly until everything was just right. And now we're at the point of tack welding the mounts on. So to locate the rear mounts on these links, we measured the width of the front mounting points on the car, and we knew that's how wide they should be at the rear, because these lower links are parallel. Using 2 straight edges, one on each side, we measured the overall width of the rear end from axle flange to axle flange. Then we subtracted our front leaf spring mount width, which in this case now is lower link width, and then divided that by 2 to find out what the dimensions should be on each side to locate these rear lower mounts. That's how we located those. Then we made sure that these were vertical in the back. We tack welded them in place. We removed the shocks before we located the rear end where it was supposed to be. And to set the ride height, we took the diameter of the tire, the overall tire, divided that by 2, and measured to the center line of the axle as to where we wanted the top of the tire to set.
We got the 4-link tacked in, the lower and upper link mounts all the way around. Because we do not have a stock rear end in the Firebird, we've got a 4.9-inch. We had to do quite a bit of grinding on the upper mounts. The axle tube is bigger and kind of more squared off than on the stock GM rear end. But anyway, we got it to fit pretty good. We're happy with it. One thing that's pretty cool is this kit comes with this installation jig. And so what you do is, once you have all your measurements and everything you're happy with, you adjust your upper links to the length you want, and then you line it up and you get this the same size, and this will bolt in place of the links. And what that does is it keeps it a little bit more square, since these pivot side to side, but also you don't have to worry about burning out the bushings in this, so you can leave this bolted in there while you tack weld the mounts in place. So at this point, we're looking pretty good. We're going to drain the gear oil from the diff just to make sure we don't have to worry about burning it, and we'll go ahead and stitch everything else in place, and we'll check in with you after that. So we finished getting the lower and upper link mounts welded completely in. We decided to give everything a fresh coat of black paint while we have it apart, and so we're about ready to put the wheels back on and lower it. We got the coilovers mounted at kind of a preliminary height. We're gonna just snug up the bolts and set it back down, make sure everything looks okay, and then we'll jack it back up and tighten everything down for good. Well, she's back on the ground and looks great. So we're gonna get her back up in the air and torque everything down with the weight on the suspension. So we'll lift it by the axle. And we prefer to use Loctite 243 on all our nuts and bolts, especially on things like suspension. You really don't want those moving. So this is our preferred thread locker to keep everything snug on there. So it'll take some fine tuning after that to get the height just right and the pinion angle, but everything's looking really good. Okay, so we got everything all painted and torqued down to spec. We're really happy with everything looks. It came out looking really clean. Definitely good enough for a daily driver. So what do you think? Does it look good?
It looks good.
So in conclusion of the Ridetech 4-link install, we ran into a few hiccups along the way that you may not run into. This car has been mini tubbed already. It has a 4.9-inch. So those were factors there. We had to grind the upper link tabs to fit on the 4.9-inch. And the mini tubs, we had to grind the cradle down just a little bit so that it wouldn't stick out into the wheel wells. One thing we did come across was that in fitting the rear cradle up into the car, we had to hammer on the floorboard a little bit to get it to seat all the way up. And it required a little bit of brute force there. But overall, it went in pretty nice. And you can tell, one thing you can tell is that the suspension is very high quality. Everything fits together really nice. And all the parts that they have in this kit are the right ones for the job. And even just in moving it around afterwards in the garage, you can tell the suspension flexes much better and much more smooth than it did with the leaf springs. Since this car was modified, it took a much higher skill level than if your car was all original, because of all the modifications that we had to do as a result of the modifications that were already done to the car. But still, it takes a fair level of skill and fabrication in measuring things, checking things, welding, to be able to install this yourself. So make sure you're up for the job if you're going to do that. When you're checking pinion angles, centering the axle, getting it right in the wheel wells, it takes some measuring to make sure everything is dead on right. We've got the preliminary adjustments on the suspension set up. Once I can drive it, I'll fine tune it and get everything dialed in just right. Also doing subframe connectors and body bushings here at the same time. So we'll finish that before I take it out for a drive. But once we get the drive in, I will update you with the impressions of how it rides and how it handles.